Hello everyone. In this video we're going to look at a presentation I gave recently to the Forensic Accounting Special Interest Group at Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. Welcome to this first content video of this new channel. My name is Callum and this is the Fraud Fend. If you're new here, please hit the subscribe button below and don't forget to check the description box for contact information. Every day, businesses make decisions for a variety of reasons. These may be to return shareholder value, to decrease costs, or to increase efficiencies. But the drivers of these often rational business decisions, when confronted with things like personal self-interest, a desire to achieve, and even office politics, can sometimes result in unexpected behaviours which, left unchecked, could lead to catastrophic consequences. Let's take a look at the presentation in this video. The presentation walks through a series of case studies to help us understand some of these behaviours better. Unfortunately, the presentation was delivered as a webinar off a fairly old laptop of mine, and so the audio and the video quality are not great. But I still think it's a really interesting and worthwhile topic because we can evaluate and learn some really important lessons from those case studies of the past.
So today I'm going to talk a bit about corporate governance, culture and accountability. At the beginning of the year, our first session back in February, we listened to a presentation from the Director of Transparency International in New Zealand, Suzanne Snively, on whistleblowers, their rights, protections, and the role they play in holding organisations to account. It's an interesting idea because when we think about recent events around the world and even in our own country, names like Wells Fargo, the Australian Royal Commission on Banking, Financial Markets Authority, and Reserve Bank of New Zealand report on culture and conduct, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Westpac Banking Group. It feels like there's never been a greater emphasis on good corporate governance, or good corporate behaviour and culture and conduct. And yet we continue to see failures. In fact, if good corporate governance actually worked, there would be no need for whistleblowers. And yet we know that whistleblowers have a more important role than ever in organizations and keep making them accountable. It's almost as if we've become more aware of the need for better corporate governance and culture, we've actually gotten worse at fostering it in some of our organizations, or we've ended up fostering a poorer culture and governance. We talk the talk, but do we always walk the walk when it comes to applying it in these organizations? This isn't a new phenomenon. Failures in corporate governance or poor corporate culture have been around for centuries, and the results have almost always been catastrophic. Maybe not immediately, but over time. And part of the reason for this is often interpersonal relations or politics, and the desire or opportunity to get ahead. And this has been true whether you're discussing things like the South Sea bubble, a failure incidentally that the UK government is actually still servicing debt on today, more than 300 years later, or whether you're discussing Volkswagen and the vehicle emissions scandal. But I'd like to work through this topic by looking at a series of case studies over the last, say, 30 to 40 years. And I think this is worthwhile because whilst some of the names and stories may be familiar to you, I think it's important that we revisit them from time to time to ensure that the lessons learned aren't lost, and to understand how those lessons have shaped the world that we see today, or how not learning the lessons from those earlier cases have allowed subsequent failures to occur. We'll start off in India. India is a country of great contrast. It has one of the fastest growing middle classes in the world today and represents a global pool of resources when it comes to manufacturing, construction, and information systems. But this growth and success also masks great poverty. And in the race to get ahead and succeed, the value of life is often reduced and corners are cut with disastrous consequences. And so it was on the night of 2 to 3 December 1984. The Union Carbide or Bhopal disaster is considered one of the worst industrial disasters in history. If you're squeamish, I suggest you avoid a Google image search on Union Carbide Bhopal. I did such a search looking for an image to use on this slide, and some of the photos are haunting to say the least. You may recall that Union Carbide India Limited operated a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, and UCIL was a majority-owned subsidiary of Union Carbide Corporation, a US company. Now, it's not unusual for US companies to have subsidiary operations in India. New Zealand and Australian companies do the same, and this is often because the cost of labor is cheaper. But on the night of 2 to 3 December 1984, there was a leak at the plant, and a highly toxic gas, bear with me while I try and pronounce it, methyl isocyanate is the name of the gas, was released. The cause of the release is still a debated topic to this day. It was known that there were maintenance issues at the plant, and this was because maintenance was an easy way to save cost. But on that night, a valve failed, allowing water to flow back into one of the tanks, causing a reaction that forced the gas to build up and then escape. The families of victims and the people of Bhopal claim that the failure was due to poor maintenance, while the US parent company claims it was sabotage. But shortly before 1 a.m., the supervisor of the plant on duty at the time sounded an alarm as the gas in the air surrounding the plant was becoming unbearable. The leak had actually been found just over half an hour earlier, but they decided to wait until after their tea break to make a decision on whether or not the alarm should be sounded. The plant operated a dual alarm system. One alarm was focused on the plant to alert workers, and the other was directed towards the town to warn and alert the surrounding population. When the alarm sounded, the plant workers evacuated and headed upwind, but the town was downwind from the plant. And the alarm directed towards the town had actually been decoupled 2 years earlier in 1982 to avoid alarming the local populace if it ever sounded over tiny leaks. The immediate death toll was over 2,200 people, and in 2008, the state government paid compensation to the families of almost 4,000 victims. But it's estimated that up to 16,000 people died from gas-related effects. And beyond that, 600,000 additional people suffered non-lethal effects of the gas, including disabilities. In 2010, the former chairman of UCIL, along with 7 other Indian nationals who were UCIL employees at the time, were sentenced to fines of $2,000 each and 2 years in prison. So 26 years later, the outcome was 8 people got 2 years each and $2,000 fine. In 1989, Union Carbide Corporation, that's the US parent company, paid almost $500 million to settle litigation stemming from the disaster, which is about $1 billion in today's money. But as recently as 2012, US courts have dismissed or redirected any claim for compensation from the families of victims by considering that UCIL was a standalone entity of India, effectively preserving the corporate veil between the parent and its majority-owned subsidiary. The idea of settlement in these sorts of cases brings a perverse dynamic to the discussion. When corporates are involved in a disaster, the cost of life is often calculated by way of a monetary settlement. And this means you can calculate the cost of settlement versus the cost of maintenance or the risk taken when not behaving appropriately. Again, this isn't actually a new notion. In fact, the Ford Motor Company, Corporation, which I'm not covering in today's presentation because it's outside of our timeline, is actually a case study for that activity in the case of the Ford Pinto. The Pinto was a vehicle that Ford produced and sold between about 1971 and 1980. And it was discovered that the location of the vehicle's fuel tank meant that in the event of a rear collision, it was susceptible to rupturing and catching fire. A memo was discovered at Ford weighing up the estimated loss of life stemming from the defect and the settlement value associated with that loss of life versus the cost of recalling the vehicle and modifying the design. Essentially, what they did was a cost-benefit analysis on human life. So subsequent studies have actually suggested that the Pinto wasn't really that much more of a risk than other compact 1970s vehicle designs. But the fact that this was calculated in this way is actually a cold lesson in business ethics of the time. And as we work through these case studies and examples, you'll see how some of the behaviors or some of the lessons haven't been learned and repeat themselves. If we just look at the Union Carbide example, we can see that, so we know that there was allegations that maintenance hadn't been done. We've seen that there's believed to be human error. They misread the instruments, or they took their time to wait till they'd finished their tea break before making a decision on the alarm, even when they sounded the alarm. There'd been another decision made earlier to decouple the alarm, so what was the point of the alarm? Further, 3 safety devices were found to have either malfunctioned or not been fitted as expected, insufficiently sized or otherwise inoperable. Police, when first questioned, were telling people everything's fine, it's all okay. So even the local authorities, to be fair to them, they probably didn't know better and were relying on the fact that no one from the plant had alerted them or told them anything at the time. The hospital had never heard of the type of gas or how to treat it. Now think about that for a minute. The plant had been established in that city with warning devices put in place, but the hospital in that city has never been advised, taught, or equipped on how to treat the gas that was used in that plant if it ever escaped. And then once they'd made the decision and they'd actually plugged the leak, a plant official then walked to the local police station to advise of the leak and that it had been plugged. So they actually only went to the police after they'd sealed it to notify the police that there had been a leak and that it had now been treated. There's a terrific docudrama that has recently come to Netflix. Some of you might have seen it already. That steps through the challenge of space shuttle disaster in about 5 or 6 episodes. If you haven't already, it's well worth it. It's well worth watching it, so take a look at that. After the Apollo lunar missions, NASA was coming under increasing pressure to reduce costs. This led to the development of a reusable space vehicle, the space shuttle. The idea of the space shuttle was literally to be a sort of space truck that could take anything to space for anyone. Essentially, the space shuttle really was the first vehicle that normalized the idea of going to space. And in fact, it normalized the idea of traveling to space so much that for the first time, NASA decided to send a non-astronaut into space. A teacher from New Hampshire named Krista McAuliffe was going to travel with the crew, go into space in the space shuttle and give a science lesson or a couple of science lessons from the shuttle, beaming back to Earth, broadcast back to Earth. Star Trek. This brought, you can imagine, suddenly the first non-astronaut going to space, this brought intense public and media interest in the launch. Towards the tail end of the Apollo missions, public interest was waning in the space program. So the fact that now suddenly a non-astronaut, this is exactly the effect NASA wanted, it brought huge scrutiny, intense public and media interest in the launch. And so after 2 or 3 scrubbed launches due to weather conditions and other issues, the pressure to launch this space shuttle and get it up there was mounting. Now, the way the space shuttle works is that it has its own engine and it has a large external tank with fuel that travels with it almost all the way into orbit. And on either side, it's got attached 2 solid rocket booster engines. After the initial stage of the launch, the two solid rocket boosters separate and fall back to Earth, where they're prepared, they're recovered, prepared, and prepared for reuse. So as much as possible in terms of the shuttle design, they wanted to be able to reuse it and reduce costs and things like that. So the various segments of the solid rocket booster are connected together because they're long tubular things. You'll certainly have seen pictures, and you can see them, the two white ones on the side in the picture on the screen. But they're long, so they're made in various segments, and then they're connected together, and those joints where they're connected together are sealed with circular seals called O-rings. And for added safety, everything was done with a redundancy. They're built in a redundancy, so the seal was secured with not one, but two O-rings around each one of the seals. The company that manufactures the solid rocket booster component for NASA was a company in Utah called Firecoal. And obviously it can get extremely cold in Utah. And they had noticed during their inspections and test firing of the engines that during particularly cold weather, there was some perishing that was occurring around the O-rings. But they weren't too worried about it because the second O-ring was the redundancy, and that had never perished. In fact, they'd never seen perishing penetrate through the first O-ring into the gap between the first and the second one. So they thought, well, it's okay, the first O-ring's actually holding. The second one is the redundancy, that'll catch anything. And so they weren't too worried about the fact that this perishing was occurring, and they felt the seal would remain secure. But in Utah, it gets very cold to the extent that the shuttle was never intended, or certainly wasn't certified, to operate in temperatures that low anyway. And so it wasn't felt to be a problem that the fact that this perishing occurred in cold weather. But the Challenger launch had been delayed due to poor weather already, and it needed to get off the pad. So the night before the actual launch, anticipating a particularly cold morning the next morning, NASA executives sought a decision from Firecoal engineers on whether the launch should proceed or not. The Firecoal engineers themselves were uncomfortable to approve the launch, but Firecoal management were very conscious of the fact that they had more shuttles that were wanting to be built. Then there were more satellites coming up for launch, so there were more contracts coming down the pipeline. They didn't want to disrupt any of this, and the launch was approved. According to recordings of that teleconference, NASA executives then asked, after that approval on the phone, NASA executives then asked for that approval to be confirmed in writing. And at that point, the decision to launch was less an exercise in safety and risk management and became an exercise in, as they say, covering your ass. The next morning, the shuttle was covered in ice and icicles. So NASA contacted Firecoal again and sought a revalidation of the advice and asked Firecoal about whether a launch could occur at temperatures as low as -8 degrees centigrade. And Firecoal responded saying that they could only give an estimate down to 4 degrees, questioning what business did anyone have asking about launching a shuttle in -8 degrees anyway. And they were in a sense in a no man's land here, that no one had really thought about this as an option. No one anticipated it. It had never been tested. They were just guessing as best they could. The ice was melting, but not fast enough. So they de-iced the shuttle. The crew boarded and the shuttle launched. 58 seconds into the launch, a small plume, they weren't allowed to call it a flame in the investigation, it was a small plume and not a flame, was seen emerging from the side of the solid rocket booster. And 73 seconds into the launch, the shuttle disintegrated, taking the solid rocket boosters and the whole vehicles with it, the tanks and everything. So it's worth noting that the mechanical root cause of the accident was attributed to a failure of the O-rings, so the seal of the SRB, the solid rocket booster in cold temperatures, resulting in the explosion of the solid rocket booster and ultimately the entire vehicle. But the underlying root cause is often cited as a case study in the ethics of whistleblowing and the danger of group decision-making and groupthink. Even though fire coal engineers knew there was a danger, nobody felt comfortable enough to speak out or to speak up against their senior management. And how often isn't that the case? How often have you personally, perhaps, found yourself in a position where something isn't right, but the person you'd be speaking out against is part of the in crowd, or they're in the clique, they have the rep or the ear of someone who counts? I know I have. I've been in that situation. And this is particularly relevant in the modern era of influences, for lack of a better word. Influences within an organization are often seen as a force for good. And well, they may be, where they act in the interests of an organization. But it's an extremely naive organization or CEO that doesn't recognize that those people you value as influencers may themselves present a risk to the business because they have their own agendas. Nobody should have that much power to independently be able to influence the course of an organization other than through proper governance processes or with suitable opportunity for robust challenge and dissent. But even those opportunities need to be in an environment that's safe, or nobody below them will speak out. Not only must it be absolutely safe and independent, but it should be seen to be so. Because if those with the knowledge of risk or danger and the ability to speak out against it don't have the confidence to speak out for fear of recrimination, then the whole process is fatally flawed. Prince William Sound is a sound on the Gulf of Alaska, on the southern coast of the Alaska Peninsula. It's bordered on the west by the Kenai Peninsula, which is home to the state capital, Anchorage, on its northern shore, and a number of islands to the south and east. In the north, it has a long arm protruding inland called the Valdez Arm, which is home to the small town of Valdez, the southern terminus of the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline. And it was from this terminus on the evening of the 23rd of March, 1989, that the oil supertanker, the Exxon Valdez, with her cargo of 53 million gallons of crude oil, set sail for Long Beach, California. Cautious of small icebergs reported to have been present and floating in the sound that night, the Exxon Valdez sailed outside of the normal sea lanes. At 12:04 a.m. on the 24th of March, 1989, the vessel struck Bligh Reef at the point where the Valdez Arm enters the wider Prince William Sound, spilling 10.8 million gallons of crude oil into the ocean that night and over the next few days. The spill affected 2,100 kilometers of coastline, causing extreme damage to pristine ecosystems that were home to salmon, sea otters, seals, and seabirds. It's estimated that the slick resulted in the death of as many as 250,000 seabirds, almost 3,000 sea otters, about 300 seals, 250 bald eagles, 22 orca, and an unknown number of salmon and herring. Indeed, some of the effects of the spill are actually still being suffered in the environment to this day. At a weight of 214,000 deadweight tons, the scary thing is that the Exxon Valdez is very much at the smaller end of the supertanker scale, but the results were nonetheless catastrophic. The disaster became the subject of blame and finger pointing, as you can imagine, claim and counterclaim. And the resulting litigation saw actual damages awarded against Exxon of $287 million and further punitive damages of $5 billion. Now, an interesting side note here is that to cover these costs, Exxon obtained a $4.8 billion line of credit from JP Morgan, who then went on to create the first modern credit default swap, CDS, so that they wouldn't need to hold as much cash in reserve against the risk of Exxon's default. And of course, we all know the future use and consequences of credit default swaps in the 2007-2008 global financial crisis in relation to subprime mortgages as well, and how they were balanced out there, or how they were swapped around. The mortgages were all mixed up and into these instruments. So Exxon appealed the ruling, and in 2002, the damages awarded were reduced to $4 billion. Exxon was still not satisfied and appealed the case again. And in a bizarre twist, the third appeal ended up before the same judge who had just ruled on the second appeal. This time, the judge actually increased the damages awarded to $4.5 billion. So he had it at the second appeal, he reduced it to 4. They appealed again, same judge, and he pushed it up to 5. But this was, to be fair to him, in light of a recent Supreme Court judgment in a similar case. It was just following change in precedent. In 2006, still going on, 2006, a further appeal cut the damages awarded to $2.5 billion. In 2007, the now Exxon Mobil requested a further appeal, which was denied, and the damages remain set at $2.5 billion. So, having reached the limit of appeals in the circuit courts in the US, Exxon Mobil appealed to the US Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in their wisdom, vacated the damages awarded as excessive. So they vacated all damages and said, no damages here, and sent it back to the lower courts to revisit again. So they said, no damages, you guys go and have another look at this and come out with a new damages figure, effectively. So ultimately, damages were reduced to an amount of just a little over $500 million. You think about, originally they'd been assessed with damages of about $5.25 billion between punitive and actual damages. Ultimately, damages reduced to an amount of just a little over $500 million, which, to their credit, although still a significantly reduced amount, ExxonMobil is believed to have fully settled with interest by December 2009. And in parallel to all of this were also a few private lawsuits involving large fishing companies that had suffered specific harm in the Sound. But the ultimate damages awarded against Exxon is estimated to have been somewhere around $750 million when they add them all together, much of which Exxon actually recovered from the various insurance settlements that it received associated to the grounding of the vessel. So you got to wonder how much harm they suffered anyway. Almost to add insult to injury, shortly after the incident in later 1989, Exxon filed claims to recover the cost of the cleanup from the state government of Alaska and various federal agencies, claiming either interference in the cleanup attempt or contributory negligence to the accident itself. What a mess, literally and figuratively. The litigation itself lasted for about 20 years, and that gives you some insights into the culture of Exxon itself. Although when you're talking huge sums of money like that, you can understand, the pushback that would be involved as well. But the litigation itself is actually the tale of the story. The factors leading up to the disaster itself are many and varied. So let's break the disaster down a bit to understand what went wrong. As with any company, pressure was on for profits. Ordinarily, the crew would enter a port and either switch crews, or they would have a period of stand down to rest and recover between trips. Now, this stand down would mean time delays for the ship, and a secondary crew would mean additional wages to pay for a second crew. So the crew was under pressure to load and turn the vessel around for the next journey. After all, they could sleep once the ship was out in the open sea. Exxon had also identified crew roles that they believed were marginal and disestablished those roles on the basis that other crew on the ship could perform those duties or quickly fill those roles or those tasks or roles in downtime, as across their ships as they stood. Now, these were not practices or positions limited to Exxon itself, but they were actually found to be widespread practice in the industry at the time. Under normal circumstances, as vessels arrived or left the Sound, the US Coast Guard would track the vessels. So if they deviated too far from the shipping lanes or close to hazards, the Coast Guard could warn the vessels to come back on track. And this was a practice that, in the interests of cost cutting, the Coast Guard had ceased. But worse than that, not only had they ceased the practice, but they hadn't told shipping that their practice was being ceased. So vessels continued to traverse the Sound in the belief that if they drifted towards danger, the Coast Guard would alert them. Specifically, one of the hazards at that time of the year was the risk of icebergs. The Coast Guard weren't worried about that as a hazard, though, because earlier on, a year or two before, I think it was, the industry had assured the Coast Guard that they were going to be installing new state-of-the-art iceberg monitoring equipment. Although, whilst they had promised that to the Coast Guard, they hadn't actually installed any of it. Which is one of the reasons why the Exxon Valdez had deviated from the normal shipping lanes that evening to avoid icebergs. Icebergs, the Coast Guard thought they were able to detect themselves, but instead they were sailing into danger. Danger that the Exxon Valdez believed the Coast Guard would warn them about if they got too close. So you can see where this is going. It's just a recipe for disaster. In any event, the third mate, who was the officer of the watch at the time, failed to properly maneuver the vessel in the conditions, and this was believed to be due to fatigue or excessive workload. So it's just compounding factors coming into play here. So given the dangers as well, it would be important to ensure, or you'd think it would be important to ensure, that all safety equipment on board the vessel was working properly. And so the Coast Guard also had a practice of inspecting all vessels while they were still in port before leaving the Sound, leaving port to enter the Sound. Another practice that the Coast Guard had discontinued and reduced staff in order to save costs. But if all of these things failed, at least the Exxon Valdez was equipped with a Raytheon collision avoidance system, or a RACAS radar, which would detect the radar deflector on the next rock inland from Bly Reef and warn the officer of the watch of the imminent collision with the reef. Or at least it would have, if it had been turned on at the time. As it happens, it was turned off. It was turned off because it was broken and disabled. And it had been broken and disabled for more than a year before the accident occurred. Exxon management knew that it was broken and disabled, but had determined that it was too expensive to fix the radar, and they left it off, and they decided it was cheaper just to leave it. Finally, although not a root cause of the accident, but perhaps a factor that exacerbated it, the Coast Guard in the area simply lacked the manpower or the equipment to deal with a spill of this size, and that hampered containment and cleanup efforts. The Prince William Sound is almost solely accessible by air or sea. I think since this disaster, they've built a road into Valdez, but at the time, it was very difficult to access the Sound. So you can imagine getting the equipment there. If they didn't have it on the ground at the start, it was going to take time to get everything there, and that just exacerbated and hampered the cleanup efforts. And as if all of that wasn't enough, they haven't been through enough already. If all of that wasn't enough, Exxon then tried to blame the skipper, Joseph Hazelwood, for the disaster, claiming that he'd been drunk in command of the vessel at the time of the accident. Hazelwood denied this and actually brought witnesses to testify to his sobriety at the trial in 1990, where he was completely exonerated of any blame in the disaster. So that's a perfect example of how organizational culture and conduct can be indicative of practices or behaviors that could lead to catastrophic consequences. it's not necessarily that they will or that they do, but they create the environment for it. And that's a reason why good conduct management is so important for tracking and delivering good corporate behavior and the culture around it. Can you imagine what sort of culture must have existed in that organization, that knowing all of the faults or seeing all of the faults that had occurred in the lead up to this, they still tried to blame the skipper, claiming he was drunk, when there were witnesses to say that he wasn't. There's something wrong with that culture. And again, it's not, it's not definitive, but it's one of what could be many indicators of that something's wrong. Let's skip forward 20 years and move to the US southeast coast, away from the biting cold of the Alaskan Sounds to the humidity of the Gulf of Mexico, away from the scene of the second worst oil spill in US history to the scene of the worst oil spill in US history, the Deepwater Horizon. The Deepwater Horizon was a semi-submersible mobile offshore drilling platform, MODU, that was owned and operated by a company called Transocean, and it was leased and contracted to perform drilling operations for BP. It had other contractors on board doing various different things. They had contractors from some of the names you'll recognize, Anadarko. They had Halliburton doing the cementing and a few others. And they're not important in the sense that they weren't necessarily contributing, but although Halliburton was involved in some of the damages settlements, I think they ended up carrying some of the damages as well. But BP was leasing the rig. It wasn't BP's rig itself. So there's a much bigger picture when you piece it together. So some details about the location of the platform at the time of the explosion. The Deepwater Horizon was located about 60 kilometers off the Louisiana coastline at a water depth of about 1.5 kilometers. And they were in the process of drilling a well that was planned to go to a depth of 5.6 kilometers below the waterline, below sea level. The well that they were drilling at the time was an exploratory well. So what that means is it was designed to test sample the undersea pocket, oil pocket. And then they were going to plug it and seal the hole with cement, and then come along later and complete it as a subsea producer well. And that's common practice in the industry. Once the hole is dug, they seal and cement it and close it off temporarily, test the integrity to make sure no oil is escaping, and then they abandon the well. And then when they're ready, they come back and open it up, and that's when they do the extraction of the oil. So in the lead up to the accident, there'd been a number of problems, including mud falling into the undersea oil formation, sudden gas release, a pipe falling into the well, and at least 3 instances of a blowout preventer, which is a valve on the drill shaft, leaking fluid. The first 2 at least suggest that the seabed probably wasn't as rigid as you would have liked, particularly if you were planning on sealing up the hole again and cementing it closed. And mechanically, there'd been issues for months, including the drill repeatedly kicking as it hit pockets of high pressure gas. So that can be very dangerous because it can shatter the shaft, especially if it's moving at high speed, or if it can push up against the drill, it could damage the equipment up on the platform and things like that. And they were playing to this because by mid-April in 2010, the operation was running 5 weeks behind schedule. And in highlighting this delay, an internal BP memo warned that further delays may be caused because cementing the casing was also likely to be unsuccessful. So this is linked in again to the unstable seabed that they were drilling into, and also to some extent the type of cement that Halliburton were using to seal the hole, that BP didn't think it would be successful and would cause further delays. So let's talk about the accident itself, just to give some scope to the severity, and then we'll come back and talk to the specific practices and indicators, behaviours that led up to the accident. At about 10 p.m. on the 20th of April 2010, as the drill was being extracted, a bubble of methane gas, which had built up inside the well, escaped and shot up the drill shaft. As it did so, it expanded quickly. It burst its way through several seals and safety seals and barriers before eventually it exploded. It's believed that it exploded because when it reached the drill floor on the platform, it entered the ventilation ducts on a series of diesel engines, came into contact with some superheated metals, and that ignited the gas. So essentially the accident was a sea platform equivalent of a good old-fashioned blowout. So if you think of some of those old timey films where you see them drilling the well and you know, and eventually they strike oil and the oil shoots out the top of the little, you know, scaffolding structure they've got, and everyone dances around happily and covered in oil. That's a blowout technically, but blowouts are not really good things. They're actually really dangerous, and this is a good example, a subsea version of it, equivalent of it. The explosion itself was followed by a fire that spread rapidly, eventually covering the entire platform. That fire burned for more than a day before the platform eventually succumbed and sank into the ocean. At the time of the explosion, on board the platform, there were 126 crew. Their estimate is that the fire burned so rapidly that from the time of the first explosion, they had 5 minutes to escape the platform before the fire engulfed the whole platform. So as with the Exxon Valdez case, which we looked at previously, you can imagine how this also ended up being a finger-pointing exercise. Let's step back through some of the factors that led to the incident, and we'll see where that takes us. So the Deepwater Horizon platform was owned, as I said, by Transocean, and they operated it as well. They simply leased it on to BP. Transocean had a strong overall safety record, it was believed. In the preceding 7 years, there'd been no major incidents, but when the incidents that they did have were viewed proportionately across all the rigs operating in the Gulf of Mexico, what they discovered was that Transocean did have a disproportionately large number of safety-related incidents. So from 2005 to 2007, they operated about 30% of the rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were responsible for about 33% of the incidents. From 2008 to 2010, they operated 42% of the rigs, but were now responsible for 73% of incidents. So you can see that incident rate is climbing. Specifically, they had problems related to cement seals and blowout preventers. And subsequently, these two items are the items that were suspected as the main causes behind the explosion itself was the gas, but the fact that the explosion could have set the scene for the explosion to occur. In 2009, BP had filed an exploration environmental impact plan with the United States Department of the Interior. And in that plan, they loosely noted that the unlikely event of a surface or subsurface oil spill, and that in the unlikely event of such a spill, as the site was 77 kilometers from shore, given the response capabilities that would be deployed, no significant adverse impacts were expected. And the Department of the Interior was okay with that. In fact, they were so okay with it that they exempted BP's Gulf of Mexico operations, all operations in the Gulf of Mexico, from producing a detailed environmental impact assessment, deciding that the chances were unlikely. Earlier in 2008, the Department of the Interior had also loosened regulations so that no detailed blowout plan was required either for these rigs. So in terms of the blowout, the wellhead was fitted with a blowout preventer, which is like a valve that will shut things off if certain conditions build up or are met. But the blowout preventers on these rigs were not fitted with a remote control or an acoustic trigger for use in the event of an emergency. Now, had the well been drilled in either Norwegian or Brazilian jurisdictions, these would have been required. So that's where they can actively initiate the closure of the valve from the vessel, from the platform. Instead, what they did have was a switch, a dead man switch, essentially. So if contact between the platform and the wellhead was broken or lost, then the valve would automatically close. But what's not clear is whether that valve, that trigger, that switch had ever actually been activated. And so what they're not sure about is, as much as the dead man switch was there, the fact that there was anything automated in terms of a control to actually close the valve if contact was lost, possibly had not actually even been activated or turned on. The subsequent investigation found that there'd also been modifications made to the blowout preventer that actually increased the risk of failure. And the last time the regulator had inspected the blowout preventer was in 2005, 5 years before the accident occurred. In the 10 years leading up to the accident, the US Coast Guard had issued the Deepwater Horizon with 18 breach citations and had investigated almost as many other incidents on board. So these are things like fires and the like. But these were considered typical for a Gulf platform. So you've got a whole lot of incidents going on, but because it's typical for the industry or typical for that geographic location, there's no momentum or no desire to improve for improvement's sake. They just go, oh, well, that's typical of platforms operating in this particular region, so it's all okay. The fact that we've got fires on board, the fact that we've got 18 breach or the breach notifications for pollution, so for oil leakage and stuff, that's all okay because it's typical to platforms operating in this area. So, and in addition to this, BP engineers had also raised concerns that the type of metal casing that BP corporate was wanting them to use might actually collapse under the pressure and the conditions that this particular drill and the drilling well was being constructed and worked under. According to subsequent evidence of a number of the rig workers, the workers understood that they could be fired for raising safety concerns that may delay drilling. So here we've got a remarkable cultural failure. They thought that they might get fired for raising safety concerns that would delay drilling. Now, obviously, BP would say they would deny that. Not the case. Not at all. We'd never fire someone for doing something like that. But that's not the point. If they believed or felt that they might get fired for that, for raising safety concerns, then they wouldn't raise the concerns in the first place. It's what their perception was. So BP obviously didn't do enough to dissuade that perception, and so the perception became reality, regardless of the truth. So whether BP would fire someone for raising the safety concerns or not didn't matter. It was the fact that people believed they would get fired if they raised it, that they then didn't raise safety concerns. And that's a huge cultural failure. This perception was reinforced. We already heard earlier that the mechanic had been struggling with failure and breakages for months leading up to the accident. In fact, an independent survey conducted for Transocean had confirmed that the workers were concerned about safety practices on board, but they feared reprisals and so didn't raise the issues when they identified them. The survey also highlighted concerns over equipment reliability and the prioritizing of drilling over maintenance, to the extent that, get this, and I'm just going to read it off my notes here because this is, get this, many workers entered fake data to try to circumvent the system. As a result, the company's perception of safety on the rig was distorted. They were so concerned that if they raised safety concerns or they raised safety issues, that they would get fired, that they faked data to make it look like things were safer than they were. And the organization then, the company, thought they had a safer environment than they did. It's incredible. It's just, yeah, it beggars belief. Now, earlier on the day of the accident, a BP official on board instructed the crew to use seawater instead of drilling mud. You'd think there's a thing called drilling mud. We need to use that for a reason, but no, let's use seawater. Equipment detected bubbles in the well, which could signal an impending blowout. Ordinarily, the heavier drilling mud would have weighed that down and contained them, but the seawater was considerably lighter and did not hold the bubbles back. In fact, the House Energy and Commerce Committee investigation noted that in numerous cases, BP appeared to consciously choose riskier procedures in order to save time and money, sometimes even against the advice of staff and contractors. And on top of all of this was the pressure to meet drilling targets on time. That day, BP's vice president of drilling had been on board the rig to raise profile for and celebrate 7 years without a single lost time incident with the rig's crew. 2 hours after his departure, the wellhead exploded and the rig caught fire. Now, 7 years, that's phenomenal. And you'd think that's wonderful, but wouldn't you seek some assurances and validation? And why is this rig an outstanding, so outstanding in comparison to that? You'd make some inquiries. But of the crew on board the rig that evening, 115 were evacuated by boat or by helicopter, and 11 perished. The youngest of the crew that died was just 22 years old. In the aftermath, the investigation identified 6 points of failure, all of them mechanical and preventable. Culture was mentioned in a statement, but it wasn't listed as a finding. As with the Exxon Valdez, the litigation that followed was significant. BP sued Transocean and other contractors for $40 billion. One of these settled with BP, paying them just over $1 billion. Another for $75 million. Anadarko settled with BP for $4 billion. And the last contractor to settle with BP for $250,000, Transocean and Halliburton, which was a cementing contract, as I said, have not yet settled with BP. So BP leased and BP leased and contracted the rig, but they ended up suing everyone else and taking all this money out of it. In the meantime, though, there's some justice coming. In the meantime, BP was prosecuted under the US Clean Water Act. BP's actions were described as reckless, while Transocean and Halliburton were described as negligent. 67% of the liability was apportioned to BP, 30% to Transocean, and 3% to Halliburton. Now, under the Clean Water Act, fines are set at the discretion of the judge, but is calculated at a rate per barrel spilled. So again, you can see there's going to be debate coming in here. BP estimated the spill to have been in the region of 2.5 million barrels. The court found that the spill was actually, in fact, 4.2 million barrels. Big difference. And levied a fine of $4,300 per barrel spilled. In July 2015, BP settled with the US federal government, the state governments of the Gulf states, and various local authorities for an amount of $18.7 billion. Cost of the cleanup? The cost of the cleanup was estimated at just under $150 billion. It's funny how these disasters, maybe it's not funny, these disasters often make great movies. They've got everything. They've got intrigue, there's drama, there's tension, catastrophe, romance, and action. whether it's Erin Brockovich, there was a movie on the Ford Pinto, I can't remember its name, Exxon Valdez, the docudrama on the Challenger on Netflix, The Big Short from a financial perspective, and yes, there's a great movie on Netflix. I spend far too much time on Netflix. A great movie on Netflix about the Deepwater Horizon 2. One thing's for sure, somebody's making money. But I do find these case studies quite fascinating and yet disturbing at the same time. It says volumes about modern corporate behavior, that there is so much pressure to make money that the wider consequences are either ignored or the costs of those consequences are actually factored in to whether or not better decisions should be made or risks taken. The next case study brings the idea of corporate accountability a little bit closer to home and is likely to be much more familiar with you all. So I won't go into as much depth explaining the circumstances of the event. But from the Gulf of Mexico, we return to the cold, this time in the south, on the icy slopes of Antarctica's Mount Erebus. So you will all be aware that on the 28th of November 1979, Air New Zealand flight TE901, a DC-10, flew from Auckland via Christchurch on a sightseeing flight over Ross Island in Antarctica. The plane crashed on the slopes of Mount Erebus in whiteout conditions, killing all 257 passengers and crew on board. The accident was and remains to this day New Zealand's deadliest peacetime disaster. The public outcry following the crash led to the formation of a Royal Commission of Inquiry. Of the 3 aircrew on the flight that day, only one, the navigator, had ever flown to Antarctica before. But the pilots were considered highly experienced and qualified to complete the trip. The flight plan had been approved by the CAA, Civil Aviation Authority, back in 1977. But because of a typo, when the flight plan was entered into the plane's computer, the plane ended up flying 43 kilometers to the west of the approved route. Most of the previous 13 flights on this route had made similar errors, but remained unaware that the route being flown actually deviated from the approved route. And we'll get to why this one was different as we go through it. The captain of an earlier flight a few days prior had noticed an error between the actual coordinates for a tracking beacon in McMurdo Sound and the actual coordinates as per the flight plan. And this was reported to Air New Zealand, who updated their tracking computer coordinates to reflect the coordinates of the beacon, despite this not aligning with the coordinates in the approved route. The night before the flight, the Air New Zealand navigation section changed the coordinates of the waypoint for McMurdo Sound. This change was not advised to the pilots. They also changed the signal for the waypoint to read simply McMurdo, rather than to show the coordinates of the waypoint. And this was done, it was believed, so that the US air traffic authorities in McMurdo didn't see a change in the flight plan, as it was likely that the US authorities would have objected to the new flight path if they had seen those coordinates. On approach to McMurdo, the plane descended to between 2,000 and 3,000 feet to avoid low cloud and to give passengers a better view, but ignoring that the minimum safe altitude for the flight was on approach to Mount Erebus was 16,000 feet. So 16,000 feet down to between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, and 6,000 feet for the whole of the southern sector of the flight, either because they deliberately ignored those safety limits or because they weren't aware of those safety limits. Either way, the change to the route meant that they were now on a collision course with Mount Erebus, and that collision would be inevitable for any flying on that sector where they flew below 13,000 feet. So if they'd flown at the approved level of 16,000 feet on approach to Mount Erebus, they actually would have still been okay. But 13,000 and below, and they had dropped to between 2,000 and 3,000 to give better views. The pre-flight briefings for the pilots authorized the flight to descend to whatever altitude was authorized by air traffic control at McMurdo. But of course, subsequently, McMurdo believed them to be on a different course because they hadn't seen the waypoint change and they hadn't been notified of the change in the waypoint to the one that they actually ended up on. The confusion that all of this created was evidenced by the cockpit voice recorder, which showed that the crew believed they were flying over McMurdo Sound, well to the west of the mountain, when in fact they were directly on a collision course with the mountain. There was much speculation about whether the plane was flying in cloud at the time of the crash. Photographs found from passengers shortly before impact suggest that that was not the case. But what is apparent is that the crew did not perceive the mountain, even though they were flying directly at it at the time. And that's likely due to this phenomenon known as sector whiteout, where the white of the snow blends with the white in a layer of cloud, and the pilots are unable to tell the difference between the two. So they lose sight of effectively the horizon, and they're just flying towards white. The original accident investigation blamed the pilot for the accident, citing the decision to fly at lower than authorized altitude. But public dissatisfaction with this finding led the government to convene a Royal Commission of Inquiry. The commission cleared the plane's crew of any blame in the accident, instead laying blame on Air New Zealand's alteration of the flight plan without advising the crew, and colourfully referring to the whiteout conditions as a malevolent trick of the polar light. In his report, he equally criticised, this is Justice Mann, who was the convener of the commission. In his report, he equally criticised senior Air New Zealand executives for attempting to whitewash the inquiry by covering up evidence and referring to their evidence in what he coined as the orchestrated litany of lies that subsequently entered popular New Zealand culture. Air New Zealand sought a judicial review of the Commission's order that Air New Zealand pay half the costs of the inquiry and for review of some of the findings of that report. The High Court referred the matter to the Court of Appeal, which set the costs order aside, but declined to find further on whether Air New Zealand executives had participated in a conspiracy to commit perjury against the inquiry. Justice Mann, who had headed the commission, was a one-man commission, so he was the commissioner effectively, appealed to the Privy Council, who, although accepting that some of the evidence given by Air New Zealand executives was false, did not accept that that amounted to a conspiracy to commit perjury against the commission. And they also found that Mann had acted in breach of natural justice by making a finding of conspiracy. Effectively, with the Court of Appeal having set the damage, the costs, half the costs of the commission aside, and the Privy Council ruling here effectively quashed the case against Air New Zealand. It took until 1999 for Mann's report to finally be tabled in Parliament by the then Minister of Transport, Maurice Williamson. Let's be clear, this presentation is not suggesting that drivers of commerce lead to disastrous environmental or other consequences. If that's the message you're getting, then we've drifted way off target here. I don't want people going to work and sitting down in their next performance appraisal saying, you can't set these targets for me because CAANZ had some fella come and talk to us about how commercial drivers and targets are unethical and cause natural disaster or cause environmental disasters. But what I am trying to highlight is that commercial decisions and measures may drive behaviors that are inherently unsafe and could lead to disasters if those behaviors, likely behaviors, are not recognized, understood, or tempered by appropriate controls. The decisions themselves may be entirely rational for business purposes, but what we're dealing with is those the unexpected behaviors that those may drive, or the unintended consequences of those rational business decisions. So understanding that business decisions are made, but in a much wider context with much further reaching consequences than simply an impact to a short-term profit and loss account. And here's the kicker. Controls shouldn't just be built around the metric itself, but they should try to identify the behaviors that could drive the metric, but circumvent the values and intent of the business. Those should then be balanced by controls to preserve the integrity of the values, desired culture, and conduct of the business. If you look at the Wells Fargo stuff, almost, they had these huge sales incentives. People went out and were selling like crazy, selling products that people didn't need, selling them in ways that was costing people money. People lost their livelihood because they ended up with these massive debts that they couldn't sustain or couldn't, but it was okay because the drivers had been sell. And what they didn't have was the balance to sell, but is it appropriate? Is this the right decision for the customer? So I understand, absolutely, you've got to have your rational business decision, you've got your driver, and you absolutely want to pursue that, but you've got to think of the wider consequences and then balance it out on the other side with what those consequences might mean. So often there are those who have the ear of management. We were talking about influences earlier on. I can save you some money, I can make a performance better. Very often these people have the best of intentions, but their driver looks like it is to enhance the company, and it is, but the purpose of enhancing the company to them is actually the enhancement of their own brand. These influencers can be extremely dangerous. They often spend a lot of time calling out fault across the business, and this could be a means of deflection. They call out fault so that everyone is so busy looking elsewhere that they don't actually look deeply at the messenger. And because the fault is often justified, they don't, the leaders in the business feel like that person is adding value and keeping the business safe. The message here is to have open eyes. Don't be so focused on looking at where the finger is being pointed that you forget to look where at the pointer itself. That is good governance. Anyway, that in itself is another risk topic, and that could go on for ages, but it aligns well to the topic of governance, culture, and accountability. There's a lot of emphasis these days on organizational culture, and it's not enough to talk the talk. Organizations can have all the mission statements, the visions, the charters, the value statements, the memos, and even the training programs in the world about culture, what good culture looks like, what their values are. But if they don't live that culture and make it real, tangibly real throughout their organization, then all of that counts for nothing. So let's see if there's any questions in the Q&A. Oh, there you go. No questions in the Q&A. So, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be questions. I don't hold myself as an expert. These are just my observations on a particular topic that I've always been fascinated by, and I think lends itself well to the idea of forensic accounting, in the sense that we come in very often and you look at vulnerabilities in an organization. It's not always the immediate vulnerability that presents itself. You sort of understand that there's actually wider flow on consequences here, and when you look at a control environment, you can build good controls, but the behaviors are really hard to anticipate how the people will respond to those behaviors sometimes. Okay. Let me just check here and see if we've got anything else coming up. I think it looks like that might be about us for questions and answers. Look, I did put my my details up on the screen. If anyone's got any thoughts or questions, please feel free to reach out or drop us a line. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video informative and that you learned something. Remember to look in the description below for those contact details. Before you go, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos and content. You can also check out our Facebook page, where we'll put links to more content, articles, and topics for discussion. If there's a particular question you've always had about financial crime, fraud, or any other topic you'd like to see us cover in a future video, then please drop us a comment below and let us know what you'd like to see. As this is a new channel, we're still learning, so things will hopefully continue to improve as we go. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, let's fend fraud.